Hey guys, tonight we slip into the candlelit chaos of the Renaissance, where artists with paint-splattered hands and wild ideas shaped history in ways that'll make your head spin. Picture yourself wandering cobblestone streets, the air thick with the scent of linseed oil and ambition. You're dodging apprentices hauling vats of pigment, while some genius in a velvet cap mutters about anatomy or alchemy. These weren't just painters, they were oddballs, dreamers, and maybe a little unhinged. Fair warning. You probably won't survive this dive into their quirks without wondering why anyone thought crocodile dung sunscreen was a good idea. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and local time. I'm curious where you're drifting off from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the heart of Florence, around 1500, where the Renaissance is buzzing like a beehive on espresso. Artists like Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael aren't just names in dusty textbooks, they're flesh and blood weirdos with habits that'd raise eyebrows even today. Take their obsession with working at odd hours. Historical records show workshops often ran late into the night, with artists painting by flickering candlelight because they swore it unlocked their muse. Leonardo, for one, barely slept, scribbling ideas at 3 a.m. like a caffeinated owl. But here's the quirky bit. Some artists like Sandro Botticelli believed sleeping under a full moon made their colors pop brighter on canvas. No science to back it, just pure Renaissance vibes. Historians still argue whether this was genius intuition or straight-up lunacy. You wander into a typical artist studio and it's a mess. Think paint cans tipped over, half-eaten bread crusts, and sketches pinned to walls like a conspiracy theorist's corkboard. These guys weren't just painting pretty pictures, they were chasing perfection in ways that'd make you question their sanity. Take their obsession with anatomy. Dissection was illegal in most cities, but artists sneaked into graveyards to study corpses, dodging watchmen to sketch muscles by moonlight. Mainstream fact: Leonardo's notebooks filled with anatomical drawings were groundbreaking, helping doctors centuries later. But the fringe tidbit? Some artists like Andrea del Verrocchio reportedly kept pickled body parts in jars for reference. Gross, right? You can almost smell the formaldehyde. Now, imagine you're one of these artists' apprentices, grinding pigments from crushed bugs, cochineal insects for red if you're curious. You're stirring this goop while your master paces, muttering about divine proportions. They weren't just eccentric, they were obsessive. Take their rituals. Some, like Fra Angelico, prayed before every brushstroke, believing angels guided his hand. Others, like Titian, refused to paint on Fridays, convinced it jinxed their work. You'd think they'd chill, but no, every stroke was a cosmic event. And don't get me started on their diets. You'd expect wine and cheese, but many swore by bizarre combos like eels and figs, claiming it sharpened their vision. No wonder their paintings glow like fever dreams. You pause by a half-finished canvas, the air heavy with turpentine. These artists weren't just quirky, they were revolutionizing how we see the world. But their habits? Downright weird. Like how some wore the same smock for months, believing it held their creativity. You'd probably gag at the stench. And here's a light chuckle for you. Imagine Leonardo trying to pitch his flying machine sketches to a patron while smelling like a walking paint palette. Good luck closing that deal. As you linger in this chaotic studio, you realize these odd habits weren't just quirks. They were the fuel for masterpieces that still steal your breath today. You're stumbling through the dimly lit streets of Florence now, the year still hovering around 1500, and you're on your way to Leonardo da Vinci's workshop. The air's cool with a faint whiff of river water and drying paint. You can hear the creak of wooden shutters as you approach his door, half expecting to find him sketching war machines or doodling a horse mid-gallop. Leonardo's nocturnal habits were legendary, and you're about to see why. Historical records confirm he was a polyphasic sleeper, napping in short bursts, 20 minutes every few hours, called catnaps today. He claimed it gave him more hours to create, but you're wondering if it just made him the Renaissance equivalent of a sleep-deprived college student cramming for finals. Inside his workshop is a glorious mess. Candle stubs litter every surface, their wax dripping onto piles of parchment. You spot sketches of wings, eyeballs, and something that looks suspiciously like a submarine. Leonardo's obsession with working at night wasn't just about extra time. He believed moonlight sharpened his focus. Here's the quirky bit. Some accounts suggest he'd hang mirrors around his studio to bounce moonlight onto his canvases, creating a dreamy glow. No electricity, no problem, just pure Renaissance ingenuity. Historians still argue whether this was a practical trick or if Leonardo was just chasing some mystical vibe, half convinced the moon was his muse. You tiptoe around trying not to knock over a stack of notebooks. Leonardo's nocturnal scribbling wasn't limited to art. He'd jot down everything: recipes, jokes, even grocery lists next to anatomical studies. One page might have a flying machine sketch, the next a rant about how his neighbor's donkey kept him awake. You can't help but smirk. Imagine him grumbling about that donkey while inventing the parachute. His sleepless nights produced masterpieces like the Mona Lisa, but they also left him with a reputation for being, well, a bit scattered. You'd probably offer him a coffee if it existed back then. Now, picture yourself sitting cross-legged on the floor, watching Leonardo sketch by candlelight. He's muttering about proportions, his hands smudged with charcoal. The quirky tidbit here? He sometimes used his own spit to blend pigments, believing it added soul to the paint. You're trying not to gag, but it's hard when you're imagining him spitting into a bowl of ultramarine. Mainstream fact: his notebooks, over 7,000 pages, reveal a mind that never stopped. Art, science, engineering, all bleeding together. But the debate rages on. Was his sleepless tinkering a sign of genius or just a guy who couldn't say no to a new idea? You're feeling the weight of the night now, the air thick with wax and ink. Leonardo's habits make you wonder how he didn't burn out. He'd nap on a straw mat, then bolt upright to sketch a vein or a cloud. You're half tempted to try his catnap trick yourself, but let's be real, you'd probably just oversleep. And here's a chuckle for you. Imagine Leonardo's neighbors banging on his door at 4 a.m. yelling, "Stop hammering, you weirdo," while he's building a model of a tank. As you linger in this moonlit chaos, you realize his odd hours weren't just quirky, they were how he squeezed every drop of genius from his restless mind. You're trudging up a narrow staircase in Florence, the air heavy with the scent of wet stone and old plaster, heading toward Michelangelo's workshop. It's 1504, and the city's buzzing with rumors about his latest project, a massive marble statue that's got everyone whispering. You push open the door and there he is, Michelangelo, hunched over a slab of stone, chisel in hand, looking like he hasn't slept or bathed in weeks. His grumpy genius is practically a Renaissance trademark. Historical records paint him as a loner who lived like a hermit, often sleeping in his boots to save time. You're wondering if the guy ever heard of a shower, but running water's a few centuries off, so you cut him some slack. His studio's a disaster zone. Marble dust coats everything like a snowstorm hit a quarry. You sidestep a pile of broken chisels and notice his bed, a straw pallet shoved in a corner, barely used. Here's the quirky tidbit. Michelangelo sometimes wore his leather boots for so long they'd fuse to his skin, peeling off like a snake's shed when he finally changed. You wince imagining the smell. Think gym socks meets Renaissance swamp. Historians still argue whether this was dedication to his craft or just a stubborn refusal to deal with basic hygiene. You're watching him chip away at what might become the David, each strike sending dust clouds swirling. His intensity's palpable, but so's his crankiness. He'd snap at apprentices for breathing too loud, yet pour his soul into every curve of marble. Mainstream fact: Michelangelo's David, completed in 1504, redefined sculpture with its lifelike detail, standing over 17 feet tall. But his odd habits? They're what kept him glued to his work. You catch a glimpse of his sketchbook, filled with angry doodles of patrons who annoyed him. One sketch has a cardinal with donkey ears. Bet that didn't make it to the Sistine Chapel. Now, imagine you're his apprentice, dodging his glares while sweeping marble shards. Michelangelo's grumpiness wasn't just moodiness, it was a shield. He avoided parties, preferring to wrestle with stone than small talk. You're half laughing picturing him at a fancy Florentine banquet, muttering about proportions while everyone else dances. Here's a light joke. If Michelangelo had a Yelp review, it'd be 1 star for great art, terrible people skills. His quirks, like eating only bread and wine for days, kept him lean and focused, but you're wondering if he ever craved a proper meal. Maybe a pizza. Too bad it's not invented yet. You linger in the studio, the air thick with dust and genius. His grumpy habits make sense now. Every scowl, every unwashed day fueled those masterpieces. You're tempted to nudge him, say, "Hey, maybe try a nap?" But you don't. He's too deep in his marble world. And here's another chuckle. Imagine him sculpting in those crusty boots, muttering, "This statue's better company than you lot." As you step back into the Florentine night, you realize Michelangelo's oddball ways weren't just quirks. They were the grit behind his art's eternal glow. You're weaving through the bustling streets of Venice now, circa 1510, where the air hums with the salty tang of canals and the faint clink of paintbrushes being cleaned. You're diving into the strange superstitions that Renaissance artists clung to like lifelines, hoping to spark their next masterpiece. Picture yourself ducking into a cramped studio, the walls streaked with experimental pigments and charms dangling from the ceiling. These artists weren't just mixing colors. They were mixing magic, convinced the universe had a say in every brushstroke. Historical records show many consulted astrologers before starting major works, timing their first sketch to align with favorable stars. You're wondering if they checked their horoscope for good painting days too. The quirky tidbit here is downright wild. Some artists, like Giorgione, reportedly buried animal bones under their studio floors to ward off creative blocks. You're stepping carefully, half expecting to trip over a hidden rabbit skull. It's not just bones. Charms like dried herbs or even a crow's feather were tucked into corners, believed to summon inspiration. Historians still argue whether these rituals were heartfelt beliefs or just quirky traditions passed down from medieval times, a kind of artistic placebo effect. You're standing by a canvas, watching an artist mutter incantations over a bowl of ultramarine, pricey stuff, made from crushed lapis lazuli. Superstitions weren't just for show, they shaped the art. Take Titian, who'd only paint certain subjects when Venus was ascendant, thinking it gave his figures a divine glow. You're smirking, imagining him squinting at the sky, paintbrush paused, waiting for a planet's permission. Mainstream fact: astrology was huge in the Renaissance, guiding everything from marriages to military campaigns, and art was no exception. But the weirder side? Some artists swore by painting barefoot to connect with the Earth's energy. You're trying not to laugh as you picture their cold toes on a stone floor. Now you're helping an apprentice grind pigments, the air sharp with mineral dust. You notice a small altar in the corner, candles flickering beside a saint's icon. Many artists prayed to Saint Luke, the patron saint of painters, before starting work. Others, though, went rogue. Rumors swirled that a few dabbled in forbidden charms, like chanting over pigments to bind the soul of the portrait subject. Creepy, right? Here's a light chuckle. Imagine an artist pausing mid-portrait to whisper, "Sorry Duke, gotta wait for Saturn to chill." As you watch the artist dip his brush, you realize these superstitions weren't just quirks. They were a way to tame the chaos of creation. You're feeling the studio's strange energy now, the air thick with wax and whispered prayers. These rituals, from stargazing to bone-burying, make you wonder how much was faith and how much was desperation. Another chuckle. Picture a client walking in, seeing feathers and herbs everywhere and thinking, "Did I hire a painter or a wizard?" You're tempted to ask the artist if he's got a lucky rabbit's foot stashed somewhere, but you don't. He's too busy checking the moon's phase. As you step back into the Venetian dusk, you see how these odd superstitions fueled the art that still dazzles us today. You're stepping into the heart of a Renaissance artist's studio now, somewhere in Florence around 1505, where the air's thick with the smell of linseed oil and chaos. The place looks like a tornado hit a paint shop, brushes scattered, clay pots teetering, and half-finished canvases leaning against walls like drunken sailors. You're dodging a spilled jar of ochre, wondering how anyone creates masterpieces in this mess. These studios weren't just workspaces, they were wild ecosystems of creativity and clutter. Historical records describe workshops like Verrocchio's as bustling hubs where apprentices, animals, and random visitors collided. You're half expecting a chicken to wander through because, yeah, that happened. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some artists kept their studios deliberately messy, believing chaos sparked inspiration. Raphael, for instance, reportedly thrived in disorder, claiming a tidy desk meant a tidy mind. And who wants that? You're eyeing a pile of sketches, some crumpled, others stained with wine. Historians still argue whether this chaos was a genuine creative catalyst or just an excuse for being terrible at cleaning up. Either way, you're tiptoeing around like you're in a minefield of art supplies. Picture yourself as an apprentice, grinding pigments while your master barks orders. The studio's alive with noise, hammers clanging, apprentices arguing, and someone's probably burning lunch in the back. Mainstream fact: these workshops were training grounds, producing not just art but the next generation of masters, like Leonardo learning under Verrocchio. But the weird side? Some studios doubled as apothecaries, with artists mixing their own paints from toxic stuff like lead or mercury. You're wincing imagining the headaches from those fumes. No wonder they painted such wild expressions. You're leaning against a rickety table watching an artist wrestle with a massive canvas. The clutter's not just physical, it's mental. Ideas were everywhere: sketches pinned to walls, half-carved sculptures, even poems scrawled on plaster. You spot a lute in the corner, probably played during breaks to reset the soul. Here's a chuckle. Imagine an apprentice tripping over a paint pot, splashing blue across a client's portrait, and calling it avant-garde. The chaos fueled creativity, but it also meant accidents. Like the time a studio fire destroyed half of Botticelli's sketches. You're wondering how they didn't all go mad in this circus. As you breathe in the dusty air, you feel the studio's pulse. Messy, loud, alive. These artists didn't just work here. They lived, fought, and dreamed in these spaces. Another light joke. Picture a client walking in, seeing the chaos and whispering, "I paid for this?" You're tempted to grab a broom and help, but you don't. This mess is sacred, the kind that birthed the Renaissance's greatest works. As you step back, dodging a stray paintbrush, you see how this glorious disorder was the heartbeat of their art. You're lingering in the cluttered chaos of a Renaissance artist studio, somewhere in Venice around 1515, where the air smells like roasted chestnuts and drying paint. Your stomach's growling and you're curious about what fueled these artists beyond their wild ideas. Spoiler: it wasn't just wine and ambition. Their diets were as quirky as their habits, often tied to bizarre beliefs about boosting creativity. Historical records show artists relied on simple fare, bread, cheese, maybe some fruit, but some took it to weird extremes, thinking certain foods sharpened their artistic edge. You're eyeing a table with a questionable plate of leftovers, wondering what's on the menu. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some artists like Pontormo swore by eating raw eggs mixed with honey, believing it clarified their vision for painting vivid colors. You're grimacing, imagining the slimy texture sliding down your throat. Historians still argue whether these odd diets were based on medical theories of the time, like balancing humors, or just eccentric hunches that sounded good after too much wine. Either way, you're not signing up for their meal plan anytime soon. Picture yourself sitting with a group of apprentices, sharing a loaf of coarse bread and a jug of watered-down wine. Mainstream fact: food in the Renaissance was tied to status, and artists, often strapped for cash, ate humbly unless a rich patron invited them to a feast. But the weird side? Some, like Tintoretto, munched on dried figs obsessively, claiming they fed the imagination. You're chewing on a mental image of him sketching with one hand, fig crumbs falling everywhere. You can't help but wonder if his dramatic shadows came from a sugar crash. Now you're watching an artist pause mid-brushstroke to pop a clove of garlic in his mouth. Raw, no less. They thought it warded off bad airs, and kept their hands steady. You're holding your breath, not just from the garlic fumes but from the sheer oddity of it all. Here's a light chuckle. Imagine an apprentice offering a client a garlic-laced handshake, then wondering why they never got hired again. These food quirks weren't just about sustenance. They were rituals like that crocodile dung sunscreen you heard about earlier, all meant to coax genius from their souls. You're feeling the studio's warmth now, the faint crackle of a fire where someone's roasting questionable meat. These artists ate weirdly, but it kept them going through marathon painting sessions. Another chuckle. Picture Michelangelo, grumpy as ever, refusing a fancy banquet because he'd rather gnaw on stale bread in peace. You're tempted to sneak a fig from the table, but you hesitate. What if it's laced with some Renaissance creativity juice? As you step away, the scent of garlic and honey lingers, a reminder that these odd diets were the fuel for art that still makes your jaw drop. You're strolling through the opulent halls of a Florentine palace, around 1510, where the air smells of polished wood and ambition. The wealthy patrons who bankrolled Renaissance art weren't just writing checks. They were dishing out demands that made artists roll their eyes or grit their teeth. You're eavesdropping on a meeting between a painter and a noble, the kind of guy who owns half the city and wants a portrait to prove it. These patrons had quirks that rivaled the artist's own, turning commissions into a circus of strange requests. Historical records show patrons like the Medici family micromanaged everything from colors to poses to flex their power. You're wondering if artists ever dreamed of painting a patron with a donkey's head, just for spite. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some patrons insisted their pets, think pampered lapdogs or even falcons, be included in portraits, believing it showcased their wealth and soul. You're picturing a haughty noble posing with a squawking bird on his shoulder, feathers flying everywhere. Historians still argue whether these demands were about ego or a genuine belief in symbolic imagery, like animals representing virtues. Either way, you're glad you're not the one cleaning up after that falcon. Imagine you're the artist, biting your tongue as a patron demands his wife's portrait include a mythical unicorn for purity. Mainstream fact: patrons often funded massive works like frescoes to immortalize their legacy, with families like the Sforza commissioning pieces that defined the Renaissance. But the weird side? Some insisted on bizarre details, like specific gemstones in a painted necklace to ward off envy. You're smirking, imagining the artist muttering under their breath while sketching a ruby the size of a walnut. These requests weren't just vanity, they were power plays, and artists had to play along or risk losing their gig. You're lingering by a half-finished canvas, the patron's voice still echoing with instructions to make my nose less pointy. The pressure's intense, but artists found ways to sneak in their own flair, like slipping a subtle smirk on a saint's face. Here's a chuckle. Picture a patron inspecting his portrait, thrilled with his chiseled jaw, only to realize the background includes a tiny, mocking caricature of his rival. These demands shaped art, but they also pushed artists to get creative with their rebellion. You're tempted to whisper some advice to the painter like, add a sneaky imp, but you don't, he's already juggling enough. As you step back into the palace's gilded glow, you feel the weight of these odd demands. Patrons weren't just clients, they were co-creators for better or worse. Another light joke: imagine a patron demanding his dog's fur be painted in gold leaf, then balking at the bill. You're marveling at how artists navigated this minefield, turning quirky whims into masterpieces that still dazzle. As you leave the palace, the echo of those demands lingers, a reminder that art was as much about diplomacy as it was about genius. You're creeping through a dimly lit studio in Milan, around 1515, where the air's thick with the scent of molten metal and something faintly herbal. You're about to uncover the strange overlap between Renaissance art and alchemy, where artists didn't just paint, they played with potions hoping to unlock cosmic secrets. Picture yourself peering over an artist's shoulder as he stirs a bubbling concoction, half expecting it to turn lead into gold or his canvas into a masterpiece. Historical records show many artists, including Leonardo, dabbled in alchemy, fascinated by its promise of transformation. You're wondering if they thought they could paint a philosopher's stone into existence. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some artists like Parmigianino believed mixing alchemical ingredients into their pigments, like mercury or sulfur, gave their paintings a divine glow. You're eyeing a jar of glowing yellow paint, hoping it's not as toxic as it sounds. Historians still argue whether these experiments were serious attempts at alchemy or just artistic showmanship to impress patrons. Either way, you're keeping your distance from that bubbling pot in the corner. Imagine you're an apprentice, tasked with grinding up strange minerals while your master mutters about transmuting the soul onto canvas. Mainstream fact: alchemy was a respected science in the Renaissance, blending chemistry, philosophy, and mysticism, with figures like Paracelsus influencing both art and science. But the weird side? Some artists thought painting under specific planetary alignments, like Jupiter's dominance, could infuse their work with mystical energy. You're chuckling, picturing an artist squinting at the stars, brush in hand, waiting for cosmic approval, kind of like checking the weather app before a picnic. You're watching as the artist dips his brush into a pigment laced with ground-up herbs, swearing it captures the essence of life. The studio feels like a witch's lair, with vials of strange liquids and a faint hum of mystery. Here's a light joke. Imagine a patron sniffing the canvas and saying, "Nice glow, but did you have to use that much sulfur?" These alchemical experiments weren't just quirks. They pushed artists to innovate, creating vivid colors that still pop centuries later. You're tempted to ask if that glowing paint is safe to touch, but you don't, he's too busy chanting over his palette. As you linger in this strange, smoky studio, you feel the pull of alchemy's magic. These artists weren't just chasing gold, they were chasing immortality through their art. Another chuckle. Picture an apprentice accidentally turning his master's paint into a glitter bomb, then calling it avant-garde alchemy. You're marveling at how these bizarre experiments, from star-timed brushstrokes to toxic pigments, wove science and art into something eternal. As you step back, the scent of herbs and mystery lingers, a reminder that Renaissance artists were as much wizards as they were painters. You're weaving through the crowded markets of Florence, around 1500, where the air buzzes with the scent of leather and spices, but you're headed back to an artist's studio, curious about their wardrobe. Renaissance artists weren't exactly strutting in runway-ready outfits, but their fashion choices were as bizarre as their diets. Picture yourself stepping into a workshop, spotting a painter in a tattered smock that looks like it's been through a war with pigment. These clothes weren't just practical, they were part of the creative chaos, sometimes chosen for reasons that'd make you raise an eyebrow. Historical records show artists often wore simple tunics, but some went all in on eccentric styles to stand out. You're wondering if they dressed to impress or just forgot to do laundry. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some artists like Botticelli reportedly wore bright, mismatched cloaks, think clashing reds and greens, believing bold colors stirred the soul for painting. You're picturing him looking like a walking fruit basket, paintbrush in hand. Historians still argue whether these fashion fiascos were deliberate statements or just a lack of mirrors in the studio. Either way, you're glad you're not wearing his threadbare velvet cape, which probably smells like turpentine and regret. Imagine you're an apprentice, handing your master a floppy hat adorned with feathers, because he insists it channels inspiration. Mainstream fact: clothing in the Renaissance was a status symbol, and artists, often cash-strapped, recycled old garments from patrons to look respectable. But the weird side? Some, like Andrea del Sarto, wore the same lucky smock for every major work, unwashed, claiming it held the spirit of past masterpieces. You're wrinkling your nose, imagining the crusty fabric. Remember Michelangelo's boots from earlier? Same vibe. You're half laughing, picturing a client sniffing the air and bolting for the door. You're standing by a wooden chest overflowing with frayed cloaks and stained hose, wondering how these guys pulled off genius in such bizarre get-ups. Some artists even wove charms like tiny bells into their clothes to scare off bad ideas. Here's a chuckle. Imagine Raphael twirling in a jingling cape, claiming it's his secret to perfect perspective. Fashion wasn't just about looks, it was a ritual like those alchemical pigments you saw before. You're tempted to try on a feathered cap, but you hesitate. What if it's cursed with creative block? As you linger in the studio, the faint jingle of a charm-laden smock fills the air. These fashion fiascos weren't just quirks, they shaped the artists' identities, making them as vivid as their canvases. Another light joke: picture a patron commissioning a portrait but begging, "Please, no bells in the background." You're marveling at how these odd outfits, from lucky smocks to clashing cloaks, were part of the Renaissance's creative fire. As you step out, the image of a painter in a feathered hat sticks with you, proof that genius doesn't need a tailor. You're stumbling through the moonlit streets of Florence, around 1495, where the air carries the faint scent of river water and drying paint. You're trying to keep up with Leonardo da Vinci's bizarre sleep schedule, his infamous polyphasic routine, 15-minute naps every 4 hours, dubbed micronaps by modern fans. Historical records confirm he used this method, called the Huberman cycle today, to squeeze more hours out of the day, claiming it fueled his endless creativity. You're bleary-eyed, clutching a mental timer, wondering if you'll hallucinate cherubs before he even starts sketching the Last Supper. Spoiler: you probably won't survive this without craving a real bed. Inside his workshop, it's a chaotic wonderland. Candle stubs drip wax onto stacks of parchment, sketches of wings and hearts scattered like leaves. You're dodging a half-built model of something that might fly or sink. Leonardo's micronaps are no joke. He'd collapse on a straw mat, sleep for a quarter hour, then bolt upright to scribble a horse or a hydraulic pump. Here's the quirky tidbit. He sometimes napped with a candle balanced on his chest, believing if it fell, the jolt would spark a new idea. You're picturing him waking up singed, muttering, "Genius." Historians still argue whether this sleep hack was a stroke of brilliance or just a recipe for burnout. You're trying it yourself now, curling up in a corner for a 15-minute nap, but your brain's buzzing like a beehive on espresso. Mainstream fact: Leonardo's notebooks, over 7,000 pages, show his mind never rested,
blending art, science, and invention in a sleepless frenzy. But the weird side? He'd sometimes nap under open windows, claiming starlight whispered secrets to his dreams. You're smirking, imagining him snoring under the Milky Way, dreaming of flying machines? Maybe that's where the parachute came from. It's not unlike those moonlight mirrors you heard about in his studio. You're back on your feet, wobbly as Leonardo sketches by flickering light, unfazed by his own exhaustion. These micronaps weren't just quirky, they let him outwork everyone, producing works like The Last Supper while others slept. Here's a chuckle. Picture his neighbors banging on the wall, yelling, "Stop tinkering at 3 a.m. you nut," while he's designing a tank. You're tempted to beg for a full night's sleep, but you don't. He's too deep in his zone, and you're half convinced those naps are magic. As you stagger through another nap cycle, the studio's glow feels surreal, like you're floating in Leonardo's mind. Another light joke. Imagine an apprentice oversleeping a micronap and waking to find Leonardo sketched him as a sleepy donkey. You're marveling at how these 15-minute slumbers fueled a legacy that still dazzles. As you sway, barely awake, the thought of his restless genius lingers, proof that even a nap could spark a masterpiece.
You're back in the heart of a Renaissance studio, somewhere in Venice around 1520, where the air's thick with the scent of drying canvas and the faint hum of a city that never quite sleeps. You're diving into the wild sleep schedules of these artists, who treated rest like an annoying cousin they'd rather avoid. Picture yourself slumping against a wall, watching a painter work by flickering candlelight, his eyes bleary but his brush steady. These guys didn't just burn the midnight oil, they set it on fire. Historical records show many artists, like Leonardo with his catnaps, followed erratic sleep patterns, believing it unlocked their creative spark. You're wondering if they ever dreamed of a good mattress. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some artists, like Giorgione, slept in their studios under starlight, convinced that dreaming beneath an open window channeled celestial inspiration. You're picturing him sprawled on a straw mat, snoring as a comet streaks overhead. Historians still argue whether these bizarre sleep habits were about tapping into cosmic vibes or just a side effect of overworking in chaotic studios like the ones you've seen. Either way, you're glad you've got a cozy bed waiting at home. Imagine you're an apprentice, yawning as you mix pigments at 2 a.m. because your master insists, night paints truer shadows. Mainstream fact: sleep was undervalued in the Renaissance, with polyphasic schedules, like short naps throughout the day, popular among intellectuals and artists to maximize productivity. But the weird side? Some, like Verrocchio, reportedly slept with a paintbrush in hand, believing dreams could guide their next stroke. You're smirking, imagining him waking up with paint smeared across his face, calling it a vision. It's not far off from Leonardo's spit-blended pigments you heard about earlier. You're watching the artist nod off mid-sketch, only to jolt awake and scribble furiously, muttering about a dream of flying machines. These sleep schedules weren't just quirky, they were a way to wrestle with genius in the quiet of the night. Here's a chuckle. Picture an apprentice tripping over his master's sleeping palette, sending a candle crashing and nearly torching a canvas worth a fortune. You're tempted to nudge the painter awake, suggest a proper nap, but you don't. He's too deep in his half-dreamed masterpiece. As you linger in the studio, the soft flicker of candles makes you drowsy. These artists' sleep habits, from starlit naps to brush-in-hand slumbers, feel like a fever dream of their own. Another light joke. Imagine a patron storming in at dawn, only to find the artist snoring on a pile of sketches, muttering, "The stars told me to paint a cow." You're marveling at how these odd schedules fueled art that still feels alive. As you step into the cool Venetian night, the thought of their sleepless genius lingers, making you wonder if a nap could spark your own creativity. You're slipping back into a bustling Renaissance studio in Florence, around 1510, where the air's alive with the clatter of brushes and the faint musk of something furry? You're about to meet the peculiar pets that artists kept as studio companions, turning their chaotic workspaces into makeshift zoos. Picture yourself dodging a curious cat weaving between paint pots, its tail flicking dangerously close to a fresh canvas. These animals weren't just for company, they were muses, good luck charms, or sometimes just chaos agents. Historical records show artists like Leonardo adored animals, often sketching them to study motion or anatomy. You're wondering if that cat's about to inspire a masterpiece or just knock over a jar of ultramarine. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some artists like Pinturicchio kept exotic pets, like parrots or even monkeys, believing their chatter or antics sparked creativity. You're picturing a monkey swinging from a rafter, flinging paint while the artist calls it divine inspiration. Historians still argue whether these pets were genuine muses or just status symbols, like those patron-demanded falcons you heard about earlier. Either way, you're keeping an eye on that cat who's eyeing you like you owe it a fish. Imagine you're an apprentice, tasked with feeding a squawking parrot while dodging its beak. Mainstream fact: animals were common in Renaissance households, and artists often included them in paintings for symbolism. Think dogs for loyalty or cats for mystery. But the weird side? Some, like Raphael, let their pets roam freely, leaving paw prints on sketches or even in wet paint. You're chuckling, imagining a client spotting a paw print in their pricey portrait and demanding a refund. It's not far off from those bone-burying superstitions you stumbled across before. You're watching the artist toss a scrap of bread to a scruffy dog curled up by a canvas, its snores blending with the studio's hum. These pets weren't just cute, they were part of the creative process, sometimes posing for sketches or just breaking the tension of a long day. Here's a light joke: picture a monkey helping by smearing red paint across a canvas, only for the artist to nod and say, "Bold choice, Giorgio." You're tempted to pet the dog, but you hesitate. What if it's the artist's muse, and doesn't take kindly to strangers? As you linger in this lively, fur-filled studio, you feel the warmth of these odd companions. They weren't just pets, they were part of the Renaissance's creative pulse. Another chuckle: imagine an apprentice explaining to a patron that the portrait's delayed because the parrot ate the sketch. You're marveling at how these animals, from mischievous monkeys to loyal dogs, added life to the chaos you've seen in these studios. As you step out, the faint yowl of a cat follows you, a reminder that even the wildest art had a furry heartbeat. You're weaving through the lively streets of Rome around 1515, where the air's thick with the scent of fresh bread and ambition, but you're headed back to an artist's studio to uncover a different kind of drama. This time it's not about paint or pets, it's about the playful rivalries and pranks that kept Renaissance artists on their toes. Picture yourself slipping into a workshop, catching the tail end of a heated argument between two painters, their voices sharp but their eyes glinting with mischief. These weren't just petty feuds, they were creative sparring matches fueled by ego and a knack for one-upping each other. Historical records show rivalries like the one between Michelangelo and Raphael shaped their work, pushing them to outdo each other. You're wondering if they ever settled scores with a paintbrush duel. Here's the quirky tidbit: some artists pulled pranks, like slipping cheeky details into each other's sketches. Think a rival's face on a donkey in the background. You're picturing Leonardo sneaking a caricature of a pompous rival into a study, chuckling to himself. Historians still argue whether these pranks were friendly jabs or signs of deeper grudges, like those simmering between artists vying for the same patron's coin. Either way, you're glad you're just a bystander, not caught in the crossfire of their paint-splattered schemes. Imagine you're an apprentice, overhearing your master plot to borrow a rival's pigment mix just to mess with their palette. Mainstream fact: competition in the Renaissance was fierce, with artists like Titian and Tintoretto battling for commissions, their rivalry driving innovation in technique and style. But the weird side? Some took it further, like hiding a rival's brushes or spreading rumors about their work ethic. You're smirking, imagining a painter storming into a tavern yelling, "Who stole my sable brush?" Probably the same guy who got garlic breath handshakes from earlier. You're lingering by a canvas, spotting a tiny mocking detail in the corner, a rival's initials painted into a cloud. These pranks weren't just for laughs, they were a way to flex creative muscle and keep the studio buzzing with energy. Here's a chuckle: picture Michelangelo swapping a rival's paint for mud, then shrugging, "Looks like your style's gone earthy." You're tempted to warn the artist about the prank brewing across town, but you don't. He's already sketching a comeback, maybe a jab at his rival's taste in feathered hats. As you soak in the studio's lively chaos, you feel the spark of these rivalries. They weren't just fights, they were the fuel for some of the Renaissance's boldest art. Another light joke: imagine a patron admiring a fresco, oblivious to the tiny insult hidden in the folds of a saint's robe. You're marveling at how these pranks, from sneaky sketches to stolen brushes, added a playful edge to the genius you've seen. As you step back into the Roman dusk, the echo of their laughter lingers, proof that even masterpieces came with a side of mischief. You're weaving through the lively streets of Rome around 1515, where the air's thick with the scent of fresh bread and ambition, but you're headed back to an artist's studio to uncover a different kind of drama. This time it's not about paint or pets, it's about the playful rivalries and pranks that kept Renaissance artists on their toes. Picture yourself slipping into a workshop, catching the tail end of a heated argument between two painters, their voices sharp but their eyes glinting with mischief. These weren't just petty feuds, they were creative sparring matches fueled by ego and a knack for one-upping each other. Historical records show rivalries like the one between Michelangelo and Raphael shaped their work, pushing them to outdo each other. You're wondering if they ever settled scores with a paintbrush duel. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some artists pulled pranks, like slipping cheeky details into each other's sketches. Think a rival's face on a donkey in the background. You're picturing Leonardo sneaking a caricature of a pompous rival into a study, chuckling to himself. Historians still argue whether these pranks were friendly jabs or signs of deeper grudges, like those simmering between artists vying for the same patron's coin. Either way, you're glad you're just a bystander, not caught in the crossfire of their paint-splattered schemes. Imagine you're an apprentice, overhearing your master plot to borrow a rival's pigment mix just to mess with their palette. Mainstream fact: competition in the Renaissance was fierce, with artists like Titian and Tintoretto battling for commissions, their rivalry driving innovation in technique and style. But the weird side? Some took it further, like hiding a rival's brushes or spreading rumors about their work ethic. You're smirking, imagining a painter storming into a tavern yelling, "Who stole my sable brush?" Probably the same guy who got garlic breath handshakes from earlier. You're lingering by a canvas, spotting a tiny mocking detail in the corner, a rival's initials painted into a cloud. These pranks weren't just for laughs, they were a way to flex creative muscle and keep the studio buzzing with energy. Here's a chuckle. Picture Michelangelo swapping a rival's paint for mud, then shrugging, "Looks like your style's gone earthy." You're tempted to warn the artist about the prank brewing across town, but you don't. He's already sketching a comeback, maybe a jab at his rival's taste in feathered hats. As you soak in the studio's lively chaos, you feel the spark of these rivalries. They weren't just fights, they were the fuel for some of the Renaissance's boldest art. Another light joke. Imagine a patron admiring a fresco, oblivious to the tiny insult hidden in the folds of a saint's robe. You're marveling at how these pranks, from sneaky sketches to stolen brushes, added a playful edge to the genius you've seen. As you step back into the Roman dusk, the echo of their laughter lingers, proof that even masterpieces came with a side of mischief. You're stepping out of the studio now, wandering into the lively streets of Florence around 1515, where the air buzzes with chatter and the scent of fresh-baked bread. You're here to eavesdrop on the public's reactions to the Renaissance masterpieces unveiled in churches, plazas, and palaces. These weren't just paintings or sculptures, they were events, drawing crowds who gasped, gossiped, or even threw shade. Picture yourself squeezing into a packed square, craning your neck to see a new fresco while locals whisper their hot takes. Historical records show artworks like Michelangelo's David sparked awe and debate, with some praising its genius and others clutching their pearls over its nudity. You're wondering if anyone brought rotten fruit to hurl at a canvas they didn't like. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some viewers swore they saw paintings move under candlelight, claiming divine intervention or artist trickery, especially with works like Leonardo's sfumato-heavy Mona Lisa. You're imagining a tipsy merchant squinting at her smile, convinced she's winking. Historians still argue whether these reactions were spiritual fervor, optical illusions from flickering light, or just Renaissance hype getting out of hand. Either way, you're glad you're not the one explaining to a crowd that it's just paint, not a miracle. Picture yourself mingling with the crowd, catching snippets of praise and petty gripes. Mainstream fact: public unveilings were major social events, with artworks like Botticelli's Birth of Venus drawing thousands, shaping cultural tastes. But the weird side? Some folks left offerings, like coins or flowers, at sculptures, treating them like holy relics. You're chuckling, picturing an old lady slipping a coin under David's marble toes for good luck, not unlike those animal bone rituals you heard about. It's a reminder that art wasn't just seen, it was felt, sometimes a bit too intensely. You're standing by a church wall, watching shadows play across a fresco as the crowd murmurs about its living colors. These reactions weren't just chatter, they shaped how artists worked, knowing their art had to wow or risk ridicule. Here's a light joke. Imagine a critic loudly complaining about a painting's perspective, only to trip over a cobblestone and blame the artist's cursed geometry. You're tempted to join the gossip, but you hold back. What if you accidentally start a rumor about a possessed canvas? As you linger in the square, the crowd's energy wraps around you like a warm cloak. These quirky reactions, from miracle claims to petty jabs, show how art stirred the Renaissance soul. Another chuckle. Picture a priest scolding folks for praying to a statue, only to sneak a coin under it himself. You're marveling at how these public responses, like the pranks and rivalries you saw earlier, fueled the era's creative fire. As you drift away from the buzzing crowd, the echo of their voices lingers, proof that art was as much about the audience as the artist. You're standing at the edge of a quiet Florentine plaza, the year still hovering around 1515, as the golden light of dusk settles over the city's domes and spires. You're reflecting on the legacy of these eccentric Renaissance artists whose odd habits, those catnaps, garlic-munching, quill-tickling quirks, wove themselves into the art that still takes your breath away. Picture yourself gazing up at a fresco, its colors glowing like they were painted yesterday, and wondering how such chaos birthed such beauty. Historical records show the Renaissance redefined art, with masters like Leonardo and Michelangelo setting standards that echo through centuries. You're marveling at how their weirdness wasn't just a footnote, it was the heartbeat of their genius. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some artists like Raphael believed their eccentricities, like wearing those jingly smocks you saw, left an imprint on their work, a kind of creative DNA. You're imagining him smiling as he painted, knowing his oddball ways would outlive him. Historians still argue whether these habits were deliberate quirks to stand Antonio or just the natural chaos of brilliant minds. Either way, you're feeling the weight of their legacy, like standing in the shadow of David's marble gaze. Picture yourself flipping through a modern art book, seeing those familiar masterpieces, each one tied to the messy studios, starry naps, and prank-filled rivalries you've wandered through. Mainstream fact: Renaissance art revolutionized perspective and realism, laying the groundwork for modern painting and sculpture. But the weird side? Those bizarre habits like burying bones or painting barefoot, shaped a mindset that dared to break rules. You're chuckling, picturing a museum guide explaining the Mona Lisa's glow with, "Yeah, Leonardo spit in the paint." It's not far off from those patron demands or alchemical experiments you stumbled across. You're lingering in the plaza, the air soft with the scent of cooling stone. These artists didn't just create art, they lived it, pouring their quirks into every brushstroke. Here's a light joke. Imagine a modern art critic analyzing a fresco only to conclude, "This masterpiece smells faintly of figs and bad decisions." You're tempted to trace the lines of a nearby statue, but you don't. It feels too sacred, like touching history itself. As the plaza grows quieter, your thoughts drift like the evening breeze, wrapping around the legacy of these oddballs. Their habits, those moonlit sketches, pet-filled studios, and garlic-fueled nights, weren't just quirks, they were the sparks that lit up the Renaissance. Another chuckle. Picture a tourist today snapping a selfie with David, oblivious to the grumpy, boot-wearing genius behind it. You're marveling at how these eccentricities, like threads in a tapestry, wove a legacy that still pulls you in. The light fades now, the plaza sinking into a gentle hush. You're feeling the weight of the day lift, like a soft blanket settling over your shoulders. The artist's wild habits, their moonlit muses and paint-splattered dreams, fade into a warm glow, like embers in a dying fire. You're walking away, the cobblestones cool beneath your feet, each step slower, softer. Their legacy lingers in your mind, not as a roar but as a whisper, inviting you to rest. The stars are out, winking like they did over Leonardo's sleepless nights. Let the hum of the city fade, let your thoughts drift like a canvas left to dry. You're safe here, wrapped in the echo of their genius. Close your eyes, breathe deep, and let the Renaissance's glow carry you to sleep.